Well, welcome back to the Dare to Be Great, Dare to Be You podcast. I'm your host. And if you like honest, vulnerable, and real stories about what it takes to not only become great, but self-confident and bold enough to be yourself, then this show is for you. Each of my guests started out as ordinary people like you and me, but have accomplished extraordinary things in their lives to be considered great masters or experts at what they have been called to do. Join me each episode for inspiring, encouraging, and meaningful conversations with diverse people from all walks of life and industry. Leaders and brave individuals who offer unique insights into the fields of arts, entertainment, business, finance, technology, healthcare, sports, psychology, recovery, self improvement, personal growth, and so much more. Whether you're in the same fields as my guests or not, I guarantee you will walk away from each episode feeling better about yourself and inspired to take the next bold step toward your own goals and aspirations. Bottom line is, your life will improve if you dare to be great and dare to be you. And I have a very special guest today by the name, is it Dr. Leigh or Lee? I always forget.
It is Leigh.
Lee, Dr. Korie Leigh, who is an author, a doctor, and we're just going to jump in and have a conversation. I have a bio here, but rather than reading all of this, other than the fact that you're an award-winning professor and author of 3 books on grief and children and families, your work blends with clinical insight and practical tools people can use right away. And you hail from New Mexico. Welcome to the show, Dr. Leigh.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so glad that we connected at the event that we were both at in San Francisco.
Yeah, the San Francisco Writers Conference, and it's were you on a panel there too? I don't remember.
No, I was one of the book vendors.
Okay. And for those who don't know, a lot of the guests on this show are actually authors of various types, and we're going to jump into that because Dr. Leigh is also an author with a book coming out at the end of this month, and hopefully we get this show out in time for you to do the cross promotion that you have for that. So tell people a little bit about your background, and then we'll jump into the book and some of the other work that you have going on.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity and for creating the space. I think it's so important that we have spaces where we can be vulnerable and we can have these kind of conversations that society is a little slow to catch up with the fact that we want to have them with other
Mhm.
people. And so, for your listeners, I'm Dr. Leigh. Um, I come from a background that is a mixture of a few different fields. So, for those of you listening, I have a background in something called child life. And so, child life specialists are usually in hospital settings, helping children and families navigate the incredibly stressful and oftentimes traumatic experience of being hospitalized.
Hmm.
So, my primary background is in child development and the intersection that stress and trauma and hospitalization has in that child's development. So, in a hospital setting, you'll find child life specialists preparing kids for medical procedures, doing therapeutic play, supporting siblings, helping kids understand what's happening to their body, why is it happening, and what can they do about it when they feel pain or when they have really big feelings and they're trying to cope with that. So that's where I started out. I started out working in pediatric hospitals around the country, supporting the most critically ill children and families. The
So were
byproduct.
sorry to interrupt, but were these trauma patients or were they on in cancer and the full breadth and depth of it or
Yep, yeah, it would be D, all of the above.
okay.
So I have worked on medical surgical, cardiac surgical ICU units, hematology oncology, outpatient medical surgical. I've worked in pediatric hospice, pediatric palliative care. So
Oh my goodness.
I've seen children and families who have, families that just had a baby and were expecting a healthy, typically developing baby to be given a devastating diagnosis, all the way to a typically developing, healthy, normal 17-year-old that has a catastrophic brain injury due to an accident. And that family has
My
to
goodness.
navigate that incredibly, incredibly traumatic experience of having their child be hospitalized. And so that's where I started. And
Okay.
from that point I discovered a field called thanatology. And for those of your guests that are like, what?
Hmm.
So the Greek root is Thanos or Thanatos. So for those of your listeners that can remember your Greek mythology, who was Thanos the god of?
I don't remember. I know I've heard the name because I think it came up in Thor, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yes. The Avengers kind of brought Thanatos back. So he's the god of death. And
Okay,
whenever you see the wordology, that is the study of, so thanatology is the study of death, dying, grief, and loss. And so once I discovered that there was a field that dealt with the incredibly challenging things I was seeing clinically that I wanted to better understand, I went back to school and I got my master's in public health with a concentration in thanatology.
interesting.
That was essentially like the pivotal moment or like the door opener that pretty much changed the trajectory of who I worked with and why. So, up until that point, I was working with children with all different types of medical diagnoses. But after I found thanatology and I went really deeply into the science and into the history of it, I recognized in myself that working with children at the end of life was absolutely where I wanted to be, like in my clinical practice.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second because I've talked to some hospice nurses and I've had the experience of that from family members who were on hospice in the not so distant past. And there's a certain persona that goes with that. So you come back to that in a second, but it might fold into what I'm asking is, how did you know? Because that is very specialized, but it's also an inevitability for each and every single person on this planet, regardless of the circumstances that lead us to that end game,
Yeah, and
end of life experience.
I was a young child who knew that I wanted to work with kids in the hospital. That's as far as I could get as a 13-year-old. Like, I
Okay.
want to work with kids in the hospital. I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want to be a pediatrician. I thought maybe about physical therapy. I'm also a musician. And so, what I ended up doing was pursuing music therapy. However, like pretty much like the first semester into my undergrad program, that's when I found out about the field of child life. And a huge light bulb went off in my head. Wait a minute. I can still help kids in the hospital. And I can also use music and art and play and dance. Like, hello, this is the field for me. So,
That's so cool though that so you stumbled in, you weren't actively searching for it. You just took some of the skills and interests that you already had. And this is part of the bigger theme of the show, which is why I'm reiterating this. And you went for it.
yeah, I followed when I talk about my journey, I talk about this feeling that I've had throughout my life that we all have. And oftentimes we don't recognize what it is. It
Hmm.
scares us when we experience it or we try to block it out. So, from a pretty young age, I recognized I had this feeling, and I would describe it, as a gut instinct.
Hmm.
Something would say yes, or something would say no inside of me to new experiences. And it took a little time. But once, I was in my undergrad program and then in my master's, I started to listen to it way more. I started to really, really let it lead me, which might sound a little crazy. And it isn't that I didn't have pursuits and I didn't want to achieve things. I absolutely did. But I wasn't always entirely sure what the outcome was going to be.
Mm.
So in my
You're
mind, I was
speaking,
like,
I'm interrupting again, but you're speaking my language because this is a lot of the stuff that I write about from a self-help and a personal development, self-improvement perspective, just a different way of sharing that information. I'm fascinated. Go ahead.
yeah. So I had to learn to trust myself, which
Hmm.
is hard and is something that I'm still learning how to do. And it's really scary because I didn't know where this thing was going to lead me to. All that I knew was I wanted to work with children and families who were experiencing incredibly challenging circumstances. And I wanted to be a helpful person in those situations. I didn't really know what I was going to do, but year after year, as I started understanding more music therapy, child life, thanatology, everything started to build off from the next step. So a door would open, I would walk through it, I would rummage around in there, and I would find another door, and I would open that, and I would go through that. And that's the metaphor that I use for how I got to where I am today. I was talking with a colleague the other day about in high school, I almost dropped out of high school. I almost failed high school. I was a decent student, but I really struggled academically. I had dyslexia, dyscalculia. I learned differently. And back when I was in high school and middle school, talking about things like neurodiversity or even using that word dyslexia, it wasn't something that teachers understood. And it certainly wasn't something that my parents were able to recognize in me and help me get the support that I needed. And so for a really long time, I just thought there was something wrong with me. I'm not smart. I'm not good enough. I should do something different. So the fact that not only did I graduate high school, but I have a doctorate, I am now an academic on the tenure track. I have 3 traditionally published books. I do keynote speaking, corporate, presentations. That's a really, really big leap from like the 14-year-old that I was in middle school thinking there's something inherently wrong with me to being where I am today.
Well, that begs the question, though, where did that shift happen? Because you already touched on the fact that you trusted your gut. Was it really just a matter of trust and moving forward and not worrying about the outcome, or was there something more that inspired you to actually have the courage to go through? Because a lot of what I write about is building the self-confidence, which actually comes by doing what you just talked about. You get confidence. It's not a prerequisite. It's a product of actual taking action. So
yeah,
I hear that through and through with what you're saying, but was there something else there that was a inciting incident, if you will?
well, I think it's a lot of things, right? Like there certainly is that gut intuition, that moving towards the thing that scares you, even though it scares you.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do that, we also really do need tangible tools. We need strategies. I didn't have those tangible tools and strategies until I started to learn about them in my graduate work. So I just kind of stumbled along. I didn't cope very well. I wasn't super self reflective until I started to understand the mechanisms behind how do people make it through these traumatic experiences, right? I was witnessing trauma every day in my clinical work, and I was absorbing it in my own psyche. I was seeing these really tragic things happening. And in the back of my mind, I was always wondering, all right, this is an event that's happening. I'm here for a moment, for a blip, for a second in these families' lives. What happens next? And so that's, I also talk about in my books and in my clinical work that as people, when a stressor happens, we tend to do one of 2 things. We are either an information-based coper, which means we need to move towards the thing that is making us stressed to understand it. Or we're an emotion-focused processor, which means that we are going to move away from the thing that's causing us stress and focus on the emotions that stressful thing is causing in us. So we're going to do self-care. We're going to mitigate the anxiety that the stressor is producing in us. And so for myself, I am an information-based coper. If I don't understand something, if something stresses me out or makes me confused, I have to move towards it and understand it. So that's why I have like 3 master's degrees and a doctorate, is because every time I would experience something clinically and it wouldn't sync up with what I was taught, I would say, wait, there's something else here. There's something else to investigate. So to kind of, backtrack a little bit, it requires the trust and the intuition, and then also the strategies and tools to recognize what kind of a coper are you? How do you deal with stress? Resilience is a muscle that we're born with, but we have to nurture that muscle. It isn't inherent. We're not just resilient. So being taught strategies, mechanisms, tools, actual things to do can help you get through those hard experiences and also learn how to trust your own intuition.
And I'm going to ask a question. It sound a little pointed, but I'm going to try not to make it. I get that side because that's a big part of me. I have to understand the big picture a lot of times before, especially if somebody's telling me what to do. I have to understand why. Otherwise, it's like, if it doesn't make sense to me, why would I want to invest my time to do it? That's a whole different story. But you're dealing with thanatology. I've screwed it up already.
Oh no,
Thanat
thanatology.
Thanatology. I had it right. Thanatology in these situations where there's inherent trauma, and trauma ergo is tied to grief, tied to loss, tied to emotions. So without over compartmentalizing, how do you gravitate towards the information side of understanding with showing up and being present from an empathetic, not necessarily a sympathetic, but from an empathetic standpoint so that you can show up and provide care and nurturing, understanding that you're just there as a messenger, really, and a guide. You're not there to fix anything, but
Exactly.
to also
Exactly.
help them understand your clinical expertise and background and degrees that they go hand in hand, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They aren't
Oh,
totally mutually
absolutely.
exclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that model is known as the stress and coping model. It was developed in the 80s by Lazarus and Folkman, and it still holds true. And that's when somebody else is experiencing stressors, right? So when I am entering into someone else's story, their stressor is not my stressor,
Sure.
right? I am a momentary visitor in their story. And that concept of being a guide, or what I talk about as being a witness,
Okay.
oftentimes that is the most powerful thing that I can do for a family, is I can help acknowledge and validate and witness what is happening. Sure, I can provide some psychoeducation when it's needed. I can help families, kind of problem solve or troubleshoot. They want to do a ritual with their child, but they can't think of something meaningful to do. I can help with that, right? But a lot of what I do is really centered around presence, around emotional attunement, around my nervous system, helping to regulate their nervous system and sitting with their pain.
And going a little bit deeper, Korie, is that a challenge for you to have that clear boundary when you're showing up as a witness to be present? Because for some people, we're sponges. I'm a sponge.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely skew a little bit more. I don't know if I'm whatever. I just am who I am, but I have this tendency to soak up what's going on, and some of my
Yeah.
codependent behavior is people pleasing, and I want to placate the situation ad nauseum. But when you're in a situation where that's part of your chosen profession, learning to detach and show up and understand that it's not yours, but you need to be there. How do you cope with that, or is it just natural for you?
Oh, it is definitely not just natural. And it's definitely a learned process. Just like resilience is a muscle that we have to nurture and
Mm-hmm.
practice, so too is this kind of clinical work. When I first started out, I was the epitome of a sponge. There in the first several years of my work, I would feel guilty leaving at the end of the day. I would
Yeah.
feel guilty having fun. I would turn my friends down when they wanted to go to a concert or get together. Because in my mind, I was like, well, what gives me the right? Why am I special that I get to
Right.
go and experience these things when my 22 families on the unit are going through the most traumatic day of their lives? So again, it was over time learning both the science, the understanding of what is empathy, what is presence, what is
Mm-hmm.
attunement, what's happening in your brain and thereby in your nervous system when you're attuned or when you're dysregulated. What does that look like in practice? And then that's what I had to do is practice. I had to practice learning how to show up for others, how to hold their pain, and then how to let it go. And that's what I do with my clients is whenever there's an emotional experience or something is happening to them, we have to learn together, how do you let this thing move through you and not get stuck inside of you?
Yeah. And I'm so grateful that you're taking some time out of your busy day with a book launch coming up and everything to have this conversation. It's one of the joys that I get of inviting guests from literally all different walks of life to have some conversations that not everybody really gets to have. And you're bringing a level of clarity from a professional perspective into this conversation that's blowing my mind because I have certain thoughts, but hearing it from you, you've lived it, you've learned it, you've studied it, you're practicing it. And that one word there, I'm going to focus on for a second because there's another tendency. This may sound like it's going off the rails a little, but it's not. There's a tendency for us as human beings to want to try and have this end solution
Mm-hmm.
outcome based
Mm-hmm.
on A, B, C, or D that we're going to get this expected result. And the practice isn't that. The practice is understanding that's definitely an aim of where you want to go, but it isn't ever a straight line, and nor will it ever be unless you're doing a graph or something. I mean, it just isn't. Um, so can you talk to that a little bit? Because I mean, this is kind of going off topic of what you're doing, but there is that element because you're dealing with people
Oh,
that
yeah.
do have personalities, I would imagine, of the entire spectrum of preferred personalities or dominant personalities. So you probably have to navigate some of that the same way I do in my sales career. You've got people from the full spectrum of personalities. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, and it is all connected, right? And a lot of what you were talking about or how I understand it is the practice of what I call holding the both and, right? So there's the both,
Oh, the both
there's
and, not either or,
right,
yes?
right. So two conflicting experiences can exist and be true at the same time.
Hmm.
We can experience pain and grief and also still have hope and joy. And they can exist together at the same place and time and both be true. So that process of like wanting so deeply, because this is the way our brains are organized, to have an endpoint can be devastating for those
Hmm.
people that haven't been able to kind of figure out and construct within themselves what to do when the anticipating endpoint comes and goes and oh wait it's still going, right? And so it's that practice of cultivating this in between space
Sure.
of having, and I'm sure you've talked about this in your work, having to increase your distress tolerance can also be a really helpful tool for people navigating kind of everyday stresses, not necessarily the kind of stressors that I'm dealing with, but everyday stressors. It can be helpful to increase your window of tolerance and recognize that really bad things can happen and are going to happen. And we can still have meaningful, fulfilling, joyful experiences, even though those things have happened.
And just going a little bit layered, slightly deeper on that too, coming from a recovery background, understanding this um, doom or gloom. I mean, when there's a lot of people that come into recovery, it's not the first stop when they make a decision to stop doing whatever. And I'm using recovery loosely because there's a lot of different forms of recovery, not from a medical perspective per se, from a broken bone, but more from a mental and a physical allergy perspective, i.e., addictions. Um, you come into this with a concept of what if and what if this doesn't happen and the anticipatory, I call it future tripping. You've probably heard that before of how do you keep people without worrying about the worst case scenario back in, because it can be yes and with that as well that we don't know. And that comes back to, maybe you can talk about this for a few minutes, the uncertainty. So many of us really want to live with certainty because that provides assurance and security. when in fact you're in this business, the only thing that is certain is that we are going to die.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. You can think of death, divorce, and taxes, but that's not, it's death. It's thanatology. That's the only
Yeah.
certainty, is that we're going to live for a certain period of time, and that expiration, when we take our last breath, that is an inevitability that scares the living crap out of a lot of us.
Yes,
And
it
when you're in a
does.
situation like you handle with families and children, how do you help people not go there without trying to change them, or at least acknowledge it? I guess is the best way to ask that.
Yeah, well, and I think like there's two answers here, right? Like there's the children and families that I work with where the what ifs become reality.
Hmm.
What if the cancer comes back? What if this medicine doesn't work? What if they don't wake up?
Yeah.
And so for most of the families that I work with, that is their reality. That is their lived truth. And there's no amount of anything that I can say or do or reframing that will change that. And
Right.
so there is a lot of clinically, when I'm working with those families, there is a lot of validation and acknowledgement of, yeah, this is the absolute worst thing that can happen. And you will get through this. And a
Right.
lot of families can't hear that at the time that it's happening. And I certainly don't say that, you know, in the moment, but it's something that families reflect on years later. I have several families I've worked with for a very long time, and they've come back, 3, 4, 5 years after their child dies, and they've said, those first few months, I really thought I was going to die too. And yet here I am. I don't know how, but I'm still here. And so there's that path. And then there's the other path of maybe folks that are dealing with different types of losses. Maybe they're more ambiguous losses. Maybe they're
Hmm.
more disenfranchised. Maybe a death hasn't happened, but there have been cumulative losses. And one of the things that our brain is really good at doing is trying to create structure when sometimes structure doesn't exist. And oftentimes, that concept of future tripping or the what ifs is a protective mechanism. It's
Hmm.
that our brains have created, right? If I can think of the worst thing that can happen, then I can be prepared for it. And
Right.
oftentimes, in the typical lived reality of folks, that worst thing will never happen. But what does it do? It takes up a lot of mental space and it
Yeah.
activates our nervous system. So I'm sure that you've talked about this in your recovery work, and your listeners are familiar with the concept. Some people call it thought stopping. I call it acknowledging the thought, right? So recognizing that you're having that thought is the first step
Hmm.
of the process. So I'm doing that thing where I think about the worst case scenario, pausing the thought. I'm going to pause this. I'm going to take a little time out. And then this part is really hard for a lot of people. Thanking your brain for helping to protect you. Say, thank you so much for helping me think of all the worst things that can happen, because I know that you think it's going to help me. You can take a rest now. You can take a break. I don't need your protection. You've done your job. And then the fourth thing is I'm going to choose to think about and then insert the opposite of that. You know, the worst thing is going to happen. Well, what's the best thing that can happen? And then you insert that in. So it's a bit of a cognitive reframing that takes a lot of time. Again, it takes practice to practice this kind of four-step process. But over time, you start to recognize that this is just your brain trying to protect you. And sometimes you needed that protection at some point in your life, or
Sure.
else you wouldn't have developed it. And so sometimes our brains and our bodies just forget to talk to each other, and we have to remind them, you're safe.
Yeah, and I can totally relate to this. I write about it a whole lot, and a lot of what you're talking about too is I just recently got certified as an NLP practitioner and coach, certified coach, and a lot of that is the reframing where our brains, from a neuroscientific perspective, they don't know the difference between truth and reality. The brain believes what we tell it to believe, which is kind of what you're, that awareness though. is so critical, isn't it? To
And
actually be aware enough to recognize when the triggers, the patterns, the behaviors, whatever it happens to be, is, and then the very next step, which you said, is pause, to just sit with it for a second. That doesn't mean that you have to react one way or the other. And interject anything you want here. I'm just kind of paraphrasing what you said because it
mhm.
strikes a chord with me. And then the next spot really is making a different choice, right?
Well, and then there's thanking yourself. So
Or thanking it. That's the
you
third one.
pause, and then you
Oh
thank yourself.
God, I'm so glad you did that. Yes. Thanks for making me aware of that. I didn't know I was doing that.
Yep. Yeah.
We
And
can
and
have
I'll
fun
say
on this,
like
Dr.
this.
Leigh, if we want, because that's I'm married and I have a wife to point that stuff out to me, or a boss, close friends. It's like you might want to think of a different way of saying that.
Yeah. And look, like this is a practice, like we can think about it as a muscle, right?
Hmm.
And we have to practice how to use the muscle. I still do this, right? And so when I start to catastrophize, I catch myself and I pause. I do a little inventory, and 9 times out of 10, it's because I'm feeling anxiety about something in my life that I
Hmm.
haven't had the opportunity to really sit with or
Yeah.
process or like make sense of. And so for me, because I've been practicing this for quite some time now, it's like a 10-second thing. Oh, I'm having a thought. Okay, let's pause. Oh, it's anxiety. All right, cool. I choose to think about something else.
Yeah. But it, like you just said, it's a practice and it's a muscle that you've trained yourself to
Yes.
recognize, and it becomes this spaced repetition, which is what practice is, to where you don't freak out when stuff happens. And uh, talking about what you do for work, um, it may sound strange, but being around death isn't nearly as scary for me as it is for me before I got to experience that. And I'm just going to share a quick story with you, and then maybe you can riff on it, and we'll go into talking a little bit about your upcoming book. But when I was in early recovery, I was scared spitless, and I didn't have a whole lot of tools. I didn't have these things that you're talking about. I didn't have any structure. I was there, and I got a call from my mom that said, "You need to go, you might want to go check in on your grandmother. She's not doing so good." And I showed up. Mind you, I had maybe 90, 90 days or 6 months of sobriety. I didn't have a whole lot of tools, and I was scared, and I was alone, and I didn't know what to do. And the quick version of this story is I just I dropped in this level of, well, what do I do? I asked the nurse on duty, and she says she knows you're here. She may not be able to respond, but just hold her hand and tell her you love her and talk to her.
Mhm.
And that got me out of myself enough to actually be present. And I kid you not, the long story short is the EKG monitor went flat 3 times. And eventually my mom and the rest of my brothers and her brother showed up, and we got to say goodbye and have full closure. But I share that story not from a morbid perspective, but it let me see the beauty of being there for somebody when they take their last breath, of how actually beautiful it is.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it's not something to be afraid of. And when it came time for my ex-mother-in-law to have that same type of experience, it was just normal. And it sounds weird, but I had to, she was holding on so tight. I'm like, can you just go into the light? See the light over there at 4th of July weekend? Right over there in the corner. And she finally let go. So maybe you can share an experience or two of how you do that. Maybe not just on the death side, but of these other situations, in your
Yeah.
words, of how you navigate your way through that with families and children.
Well, I think what you're talking about is we talk about this a lot in the field of thanatology, right? Like, how does society and culture influence attitudes towards death and dying, right? And so, in the not so distant past, people would die in the home, and we would have their bodies be in the home, and people would come and view it. There's a reason we call it awake, is because
Mm-hmm.
someone would stay awake with the body for 22 to 48 hours so that people in the community could come and pay their respects and visit. We have been so far removed from the dying process that it has become foreign, almost like
Mm-hmm.
a myth. And the same can be said for birth, right? We
Sure.
inherently know how to birth life into the world, and we inherently know how to usher life out. It is a part of who we are. And we, and I say the collective we, as American society, Western kind of practices, we have forgotten. And all that we need are people to help us remember.
Yeah.
And so what you're talking about with your grandma is she helped you remember your innate ability to usher life out. And I can,
Well, it's weird. What you just said though, it helped me remember my innate ability, but it's an ability that's because it's innate. I didn't know that I had that ability.
yeah.
And
And
that's the beauty of this, of
and
trusting,
because
going back to trusting instincts and trusting your gut.
yeah, absolutely. And because we're social creatures, we tend to learn the best when seeing other people do it.
Mm,
Right? So
yeah.
we're not meant to grieve in isolation. We're not meant to die alone. We are meant to do this in communal spaces with ritual and practices embedded into the process. That has been fundamentally removed. There is a movement, and it is bursting at the seams, a death positive movement to help bring these conversations back into the light of society. And that's where you see, the field of thanatology is growing exponentially with people going into the end of life space and the grief space. You have professions like death doulas and grief counselors. You have people looking at things from an activist perspective. Not all people die the same in terms of their access to healthcare and equity, right? Like there's so many
Yeah.
conversations happening, and this is what I look towards in the future with the field of thanatology. Where is it going? Like, where are we going to be? We
Mm,
have the death tech industry is booming for better or worse, which can be a whole conversation about AI bots and all that kind of stuff. But you also have companies like one of them here in Santa Fe called Parting Stone, which takes cremated remains and it, through a process, turns them into solidified stones. And that does a few different things. First, most people don't know what to do with cremated remains. They put it in an urn and they're like, I guess I'll put her
right.
here, right? It feels foreign. There's a disconnect. And
Mm-hmm.
so this process that Parting Stone does is it helps turn those cremated remains into something tangible. You can touch it. You can take it with you, put it in your pocket, and it looks just like a stone. And the other thing, talking from a more ecologically conscious perspective, as cremated remains, when you spread them, they forever change the pH of the environment that you spread them in. And
I
so,
didn't know that.
yeah. And so, with stones, with these solidified stones, they've done a few different studies to look at, and they've partnered with Los Alamos Laboratories to help with the hard science behind this. There's no pH change to the environment when you leave a stone, right? So, we
Interesting.
have people that are looking for more ecologically conscious ways of what do we do after I've died? What do we do with my body?
Mm-hmm.
How is that going to impact the environment? How is that going to impact my family? How do I want my legacy to remain? So like there's a lot of conversations that we could have just about this idea of death. And to kind of, bring it full circle, part of the reason that I mean, a big reason that I write the books that I do is to help provide practical, tangible tools to families and children when they need it the most. Oftentimes in my work with grieving children, parents will ask the same questions. How do I start the conversation? What do I say? How do I answer their questions? That's why I wrote my first book, which is called What Does Grief Feel Like? And it's a picture
Okay.
book for young children. And within the pages, there are questions embedded that you can ask. The first page opens with someone I love died. And then there's a little question bubble at the bottom. Who did you know who died? What was their name? So that parents don't have to find the questions or find the words.
Sure.
The second book I wrote is a book for teenagers, and it's called It Won't Ever Be the Same, A Teen's Guide to Grief and Grieving. And it's that same principle. I provide a bite-sized psychoeducation. I have like a did you know page. Like, did you know that when you're grieving, your body grieves too? There are changes in your brain. Inflammation markers go up in your body. You get sick more often. The vestibular part of your brain that helps you stay balanced, that gets a
Hmm.
little off kilter. That's why you bump into things and trip over things when you're actively
Interesting.
grieving. So in my teen book, I provide bite-sized information, and then I provide opportunities for, okay, now that you've learned this, let's practice something. And my third book, which is coming out March 31st, is for parents. And it's When Everything Changes, a parent's guide to grief and loss. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a field guide. It provides information up front in the first part, lots of what you and I have talked about today, stress and coping models, what happens in the body when there's stress, how to address it as a family. And then it goes through the most typical loss experiences, not just death, but divorce, hospitalization,
Hmm.
incarceration, climate change disasters. It has a how to, a checklist, what to say, when to say it, how to answer children's questions and teens' questions. And as a guideline through the whole book is how to build resilience as a family through all of these challenging experiences.
This is phenomenal, Dr. Leigh, and I'm blown away. And as I said before we started recording, you just don't know where the conversation's going to go. And that's what one of the things that fulfills me the most about having guests like you on this show, because it's conversation that isn't happened in a coffee shop per se. And now you and I have an opportunity to share this out there with others who are in similar situations. I mean, I'm at the back end of the baby boom. There's going to be a lot of this stuff going on over the next 20 to 30 years with a little bit of a gap. And then another huge bubble equal or greater to the one that I'm at the back end of in terms of another boom. So this is not going away anytime soon. But you have an opportunity to celebrate another book release. And I love what you did too, is you started with kids. Was that intentional? Kids, teenagers, parents? Did you plan that or did it just kind of happen that way?
I didn't like consciously, I didn't plan it. I think unconsciously it was all working in the background.
Sure.
But I wrote the first book after I experienced my own incredibly profound loss. And I was very early in my grief. And it was something I was thinking about. I had wanted to write a children's book for about 5 years. And every time I would go to write something, it didn't sound right. I didn't like it. So I tabled it. And then during the peak of COVID, when we were all social distancing and locked in our homes, I was really isolated and grieving. And I just sat down at the table, and it was just one of those moments that just it channeled through me.
I
And
love
then
that.
a month after that, I wrote what then would become the second book. My first two books did so well. My publisher asked if I'd be interested in writing a parenting book, and so that's how the parenting book came to be.
So where is it going to be and how do people find it and you if they're in it and if you're going to do any speaking tours or book signings in and around at least the New Mexico area or if you're going state to state?
Yeah, so you can find more about my practice and my speaking work at KorieLeighPhD.com. That's
Can you spell that out too?
yep,
Yeah.
it's KorieLeighPhD.com. I am also on Instagram at Dr. Korie Leigh. And I do have a TikTok. I don't use it as much, but I do have it. So you can find me there. But my publisher is Free Spirit Publications, and you can find my book anywhere books are sold. You can order it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. My preference is you go to your indie bookstore and ask them to order it for you. They will be able to access it. It's officially out March 31st. If any of your listeners work in this space, work with families, work for an organization that deals with grief and loss, and you would like an advanced e-version, you can send me an email through my website and my publisher will send you an advanced e-version.
That's
I,
awesome.
I oftentimes will have nonprofit organizations get a hold of one of my books and then reach out and ask if I will come and do a workshop or a presentation or speak with them. So I'm also available for that. And I'll be kind of all over the country in the next few months. I have speaking engagements booked in Indiana and Texas, New Mexico, and I will also be abroad speaking at a conference in Italy in May.
I'm so happy for you and thrilled that we got to meet each other in passing at a book conference and a writers conference. And less than around a month later, a little bit less, here we are having a conversation to carry your message out into the world. And it's been a delight. Thank you for being my guest and all the best to you. I know there's going to be some synergies because some of the other guests that I have that follow the show fairly regularly are in different but um, parallel fields where they're working closely with individuals, whether it's women or kids or adults, and you just never know. And that's the other beauty of why I do this is to help bring people together to carry a message. And the bigger theme here is to carry a message of hope to those who need to hear it or want to hear it. And you've done that in spades today. I am so appreciative.
Thank
Uh,
you so much for having me on your show and for, like I said, creating the space to have these vulnerable conversations. And I hope that your listeners have found our conversation to be helpful. Maybe it sparked an idea within them. Please reach out and let me know how the episode sat with you.
Thank you again. And folks, this has been Dare to Be Great, Dare to Be You. I'm your host, Shawn Langwell. Tune in next time. We've been visiting for the last 45 minutes or so with Dr. Leigh. And thank you again. Have a wonderful book launch, and we'll talk soon.
Awesome. Thank you.